So we were talking in that last session about the changing face of teens. I want to move that to the next thing that I think we have to look at is the changing face of youth ministry. How has youth ministry been responding in some ways to all of these cultural shifts that we've been talking about that have gone on with teenagers? I think the easiest way to do that is to find a lens that we could use to look at the history of youth ministry. I think one of the most concise ones, there's lots of different ways that you could do this, but one of the most concise ones was Mark Ostreicher's book, Youth Ministry 3.0, because he just kind of puts it into this, an image that we can just look at pretty quickly, where he calls it Youth Ministry 1.0, was in the mid-40s to the early 60s. The big fixation, he talks about how there's these driving needs that young people are kind of working out in their adolescent years. Identity, autonomy, and affinity. And he kind of is demonstrating from more of a psychological or counseling type of perspective that though all three of these things are things that teens are processing and working on in their life, there's ways that you can see how there is a cultural fixation on one of them at certain periods of history. And so the youth ministry that was done during that particular time really fixated on that cultural fixation. So identity was really the driving thing in this first period, right? A lot of the earmarks of the way that ministry was done was evangelization or evangelism, correction, moral correction, right? So this was kind of the birth of youth culture that we see happening during this time. A lot of it was focused on proclamation. So these are the big tent revival events, the Billy Graham crusades and the Youth for Christ big events that started emerging in places. This is right around the time that you also see Young Life kind of coming into existence. So the whole focus really was on preaching, teaching, and bringing somebody to a place of making a decision about their faith, right? Well, we see that really shift as we come into the 70s. Youth Ministry 2.0, the cultural fixation was autonomy. And we really see this happening in just the cultural things that were happening during this time, how young people were really isolating themselves from adults. And so the way ministry responded, the church, Protestant, evangelical, and we even see Catholic youth ministry really kind of getting its footing during this period of history. That whole fixation on autonomy, I think the response was, let's create an environment where young people can be separate from adults, but in a way that we can kind of context the environment in a way that's safe, right? Morally safe. So church youth groups kind of emerge. You see Protestant evangelical ministry really shift from the whole proclamation to programs, youth rooms and youth centers and camps and retreats and conferences. Like all of these things kind of all start becoming a part of the whole backdrop of the way that we're doing ministry with kids during this time. Now, Mark Ostreicher is basically saying that in the early 2000s, we have another big shift happening, right? Like the cultural fixation is actually affinity. And he's, I think, identifying a reality that young people today are wired differently than kids were even 10, 15 years ago. There's been a cultural shift, and the way that they're wired is more around affinity than even autonomy. Now, it doesn't mean that teens today aren't trying to find their autonomy and their independence. It doesn't mean that they're not struggling to find out who they are and really discover their identity. Those are also needs. He's just saying that the most important one, the one that really seems to be the fixation of the culture, is affinity. And affinity is, how do I fit in with this group of people? Like teens really thrive on tight connections. Because there's such a starvation for intimacy, I think this is a way that they, you see lots of cliques and lots of groups that form in their world, right? So this is kind of I think a broad lens that helps us understand the historical development of youth ministry. Let's kind of look at this from more of a Catholic perspective. What happened in Catholic youth ministry? Well, we really see, Catholic youth ministry kind of beginning back in the early 30s. And it was Catholic schools primarily. This is the way that we minister to our kids, was we taught them the faith, right? Baltimore Catechism era. Well, the 30s all the way up to the 70s, we have kind of the Catholic school approach, but then the emergence at a certain time of the CYO program, the Catholic Youth Organization, CCD, the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, religious education happening in parishes. So this was kind of the way that we approached the way that we minister to kids. Well, in the 70s, just like what Ostreicher points out, there was a big shift. Post-Vatican II, we see a decline in participation of people in the church, just adults in general. There starts to emerge a new generation of youth ministers. I think in many ways we were following on the heels of the Protestants and the evangelicals. But in 1976, the U.S. bishops come out with kind of the driving document for Catholic youth ministry, a vision for youth ministry. And that document was really trying to create a framework for understanding what ministry to young people needed to be. And so that document had 7 components of youth ministry, but it was giving a vision and a framework for what that kind of ministry needed to look like. Well, in the 1990s and into the 2000s, this is where we see the big change, right? And I think this is Youth Ministry 3.0 that Ostreicher's talking about. We have the whole range of adolescence expanding in both directions. So you have what used to be teenagers, maybe 13 to 18 years old, was actually going lower, down to 8 and 9 years old, and going higher, sometimes into the mid-20s, late 20s, sometimes even early 30s, where you see characteristics, earmarks of youth culture very, very prevalent, even in people who are adults in their late 20s and early 30s. So youth culture, what was traditionally just seen in that, that short span of 13 to 18 has just expanded, right? In the mid-90s, the U.S. bishops did an updated document, and again, this is meant to be a vision, a framework, so the Renewing the Vision document in 1996, they add a component. Now there's 8 components of comprehensive and balanced youth ministry. Ministry needs to be flexible and adaptable. It needs to partner with parents. It needs to be intergenerational. So there's lots of things that the Renewing the Vision document points to, right? But the thing that I want to really look at with us today is I want to look back to those myths, because I truly believe that one of the things that we've experienced, and I really do just think that it's kind of cultural reality, there have been so many cultural shifts happening in this particular time in history that the way we've responded is by constantly responding to the cultural changes and the cultural shifts that we're seeing, instead of maybe asking a deeper question of what do young people really need? So instead of trying to provide for them what we think they need based upon the cultural lenses that we're looking through, we actually look much deeper, right? So let me give you an example. If we look at some of these myths that we talked about in the last session, teens hate their parents. I mean, isn't the way that youth ministry is fundamentally put together all kind of rooted in that myth? And maybe that was true back in the 70s when it first emerged, but it's not true today. It's definitely not true. And so if youth ministry is constantly isolating young people from their parents, which study after study after study conclusively shows have the greatest impact on the faith practice and faith life of their children, parents. Wait a second. If study after study is conclusively showing that parents have the biggest impact, hands down, over any youth minister, over any teacher. Parents have the biggest impact on the faith life and the faith practice of their own children, good or bad, right? If that's fundamentally true, then why would we set up a youth ministry system and environment that constantly isolates kids from their parents and doesn't really engage parents in that? That's definitely not part of the Renewing the Vision framework, which specifically says to partner with parents. I mean, it talks about the three driving goals of youth ministry, about making disciples of young kids. I'm not convinced that the way that we do youth ministry really does that, right? Teens want, second myth, teens want, even need to be completely independent of adults. Again, this fosters that whole environment. We've already shown that that's a myth. It's not true. High percentages of teens actually want to be in relationship with adults, be around adults, have meaningful conversations with adults, especially their parents. Yet we've created an environment for youth ministry that pulls kids away from their parents and pulls kids away primarily from lots of other adults. We put them on the bunny slope. Teens don't like church and are going to constantly rebel if we make them go. So the approach to youth ministry has been to make church hip, to make it relevant, to make it engaging, to make it fun and funny, right? So we've gone to great efforts to make it entertaining so that kids will come. I love, one of my favorite authors is Kenda Creasy-Dean. She was involved with Christian Smith with the Soul Searching, the National Study on Youth and Religion. She's written a number of books herself. One was called Almost Christian. But this is one of Kenda's quotes. "We think they want cake, but actually they want steak and potatoes. But we keep giving them cake because we think that's what they want." You see, it's rooted in a myth that young people can't be serious about faith, that young people need to be entertained, that young people don't want to really talk about deep things. It's all a myth. And in my experience over the last 15 years, as I've been doing real intentional discipleship and working with small groups of young people in ways that I'd never done in all of the other years that I've been doing ministry, I have seen dramatic transformations happen in the lives of kids. Kids who were serious, kids who were passionate, kids who were responsible, kids who were mature, and they wanted to dig deep. They wanted steak and potatoes, and so that's what I started giving them. They don't want any more cake. But that's what we keep giving them. Teens are immature and incapable of serious relationships. Like I said, I don't believe this to be true. You can look at the previous point. More cake. We just keep giving them more cake. Teens aren't capable of a serious faith decision. That can happen later in life. Again, I talked about this earlier, that's a myth. It's just not true. But because we think that they're incapable of serious faith decisions, we constantly are trying to take the catechesis of the faith, the teachings of our faith, and we're trying to sprinkle it with all kinds of things that make it entertaining. And what we're finding, I believe, is lots and lots of teens who have just become anemic to that approach. They don't want it in a slick package. They don't want it, they don't need you to try and make it relevant for them or make it cool. Teens want to know the truth because I think there's a diminished capacity in them for truth, yes. But if you awaken that deep human need and deep desire for truth and you let that start to come alive in them, they're going to start being hungry for it. You don't got to water it down. You don't got to package it up in a way for them to receive it. I think they're capable of more than we give them credit for. I think it's worth asking. And this is a hard question, but I think it's a question that needs to be asked. Is it possible that conventional youth ministry, generally speaking, has bought into these myths? Maybe worse, has actually perpetuated them. Have we actually built a whole system of the way to minister to kids that's actually built upon a bunch of myths that aren't really true, especially for young people today? Maybe it's better to ask the question, is it working? Is what we're doing really working? And I get criticized for being a naysayer, for being a doom and gloom person. I've heard all kinds of different things about people's interpretation of me asking these kinds of questions. But I don't think you can argue with the reality of our situation. Is it working? I mean, let's just look at the church in general, outside of youth ministry. There are 200,000 churches. This is a study that just recently came out from Group Publishing. Why nobody's going to church anymore. There's 200,000 churches across the United States that are in various stages of decline. 4,000 churches a year close their doors and never open again. Well, maybe you hear those numbers and you're like, well, yeah, that sounds pretty bad. But, well, guess how many churches there are total in the United States? 350,000. 200,000 of them are in various stages of decline. 4,000 a year are shutting their doors permanently. We are losing traction. The way we've been doing things isn't working. So let's ask the question, is Catholic youth ministry thriving? I don't think so. And I'm sorry if I'm a naysayer. I'm sorry if I'm a doom and gloom person. I think somebody's got to ask the question. When you can look at the landscape of youth ministry in the United States, and the basic reality is that we only have youth ministry happening in about 25% of our 17,600 parishes in this country. Active, engaging, weekly youth ministry in only about 25%. And only half of those have hired a full-time person to be committed and dedicated to that ministry. That's only 12%. That means 88% of the parishes out there have somebody part-time or stipended or volunteering to try and do something for the youth of their parish. Or there's nothing going on at all, which that, unfortunately, is a reality in over 50% of the parishes in this country. Like, those are the real statistics. And so let's say, well, okay, well, at least we got something going on in 25% of the parishes, right? Well, in those 25% of the parishes, we're engaging less than 25% of the teens in those communities, which means 75% of the kids are not getting touched because they're not even involved. They're not even getting engaged. I'm sorry, folks, this isn't working. And we have to recognize that this is the truth. If the statistical evidence proves that adults who are actively practicing their faith, high percentages of them made a decision to do so before the age of 13, then we need to do everything that we can to reach every young person that we can. And I don't know about you, but I'm just not willing to settle for stats like 75% of the parishes aren't doing anything, and 75% of the kids in the parishes where we are doing something aren't even being affected. And to be completely honest, I actually think the 25% mark of engagement of teens in most parish communities is being really generous. I actually think it's much lower than that. I know lots of parishes that have thriving youth ministry programs, sometimes a couple hundred kids that are participating. Well, when you really look at the parish books, they've got 1,000 kids that are involved in that parish. 1,500 kids who would be on the books. So 100 kids involved is actually only about 10% or less, right? Like, we're not actually thriving. And I think that is one of the things that we have to recognize. I think another big problem is there's this basic thinking that participation equals success. So you maybe could make an argument that, wow, the Catholic Church has got a lot of kids participating. Well, we have millions of young people that go to World Youth Day. I'm sorry, I don't think that event is transforming their lives. It may be a great experience for many young people, but if it's not followed up and rooted into daily discipleship and week in and week out, somebody being a part of that kid's life, That's just going to be a great experience that they had. It's not going to make them a disciple. You know, participation, kids showing up, isn't success. We can have confirmation programs and we can have things that get kids to come, but that doesn't make disciples, right? I mean, that's as much of a fallacy as this is. Participation equals retention. The National Study on Youth and Religion proved that not to be true. I mean, they studied young people, Protestant, evangelical, Catholic, all across the board. They studied kids, they researched, they interviewed, they did all kinds of things, asking kids questions, and what they found was high percentages of kids who were really involved in their churches couldn't even articulate the basic tenets of their faith. So their participation, weekly participation, was actually not leading to retention. So what do we do, right? I think this is another big issue that is a part of the landscape today, right? Is that serious faith practice, serious involvement is going to make teens religious extremists. I know that this isn't our perspective, but this is what we're fighting against, right? I mean, I can't tell you the number of parents over the years that I've almost been in arguments with because they're concerned that their kid was becoming too holy. I had some girls that went through one of the conferences that we went to where there was a talk on chastity and modesty. And these girls, in a very beautiful, beautiful way, removed that they were dressing in a way that was not modest. And so they wanted to change the way that they dressed, and they wanted to search for clothes that were more modest. And next thing I know, I've got a mother coming to the youth office who's angry that I'm turning her girl into a nun. And it's like, what's wrong with this picture? You know, I had a kid once who had this dramatic conversion experience on a retreat because he was looking at pornography. And he was really convicted during a men's session that we did in the retreat that he had to get this out of his life. And we had made a comment on the retreat that we needed to, you needed to do whatever you needed to do to cut off your access. Well, a couple days later, I got a very furious dad coming into the youth office who's just irate because his kid went home and took a screwdriver to the back of his computer and damaged the internet connection. I mean, he cut off access. That's exactly what he did. I mean, to me, it's like, why would you ever let your kid have a computer with internet access in his bedroom? Come on. You can't do that, parents. Why would a mother fight with me about her daughter wanting to dress more modestly and really be a witness to virtue and to chastity? But this is the landscape that we're in. We've got parents who are not supporting what we're doing, but parents, good or bad, hands down, have the greatest impact on the faith life and faith practice of their kids. So if I think that I'm going to make a difference in this kid's life without somehow trying to address the issue of the parent, I'm fooling myself. That may have been able to happen 15, 20 years ago. It's not going to happen today, by and large. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be some of those miraculous stories of a kid who has a powerful conversion experience. The parents actually oppose their faith, but the kid still converts and gets traction anyway. I think that's going to be very, very rare. I mean, Christian Smith's follow-up study to the National Study on Youth and Religion, he published another book called Souls in Transition. You should read that study because one of the shocking things that he finds is that young people who were highly, highly involved in their churches, weekly participation, and then even gave their lives a period of time to short-term or long-term mission experiences, went overseas, some of them. Teens whose parents were atheists, agnostics, or non-practicing. Kids, even with 4 or 6 years of active engagement and involvement, as they transition into their young adult years, still followed their parents. They mimic their parents' faith practice, particularly as they come into their own adult years. So parents who are not practicing the faith have the last word. No matter what we do, no matter how effective what we do is, parents are going to have the last say because those kids ultimately are going to follow their parents' example. Something has to change. Something needs to change in the way that we do youth ministry. I'm just fundamentally convinced that the way that we're doing it isn't working. And we've got to address the real driving needs of teens. And we have to come up with a system and a structure that somehow more effectively engages parents and draws lots of adults into the process of trying to minister to kids. I truly believe that youth ministry is not going to be effective unless we start moving in that direction. Like, here's a big realization that I had. When I started looking at the way that I was doing youth ministry, youth conferences, been highly involved in Steubenville conferences for years, youth retreats, camps, youth group meetings. I've done it all over the last 30 years in a number of different parishes. But when I look at the incredible change that you can witness in young people, so you look at those cultural shifts, the perfect storm that happen and all of the changes that happen to kids. It's enormous, seismic changes, seismic shifts, right? Like the ground is moving underneath things like an earthquake. So we can see those dramatic changes in kids. My question would be, have we changed like that in the ministry that we offer? Well, when I look at a typical conference that I would take a group of kids to, it's dressed up in different clothes. It's a different package, different theme. Sometimes some of the things get configured differently. But by and large, it's pretty much, you have talented, gifted speakers who stand up on a stage who give a talk to thousands of kids sitting in a crowd. That fundamentally has not changed in over 25 years, maybe longer. How is it possible that the way that we're doing youth ministry, the youth group style setting, from clear back into the 1970s, we're still doing today when there's been these radical seismic changes that have happened with kids? How can we think that it possibly is going to connect with them? Something needs to change. I think the way that we do ministry needs to change, and it needs to be a change that's not just repackaging or retooling. It needs to be a fundamental change that truly addresses the driving needs of kids more effectively than we are with what we're doing. I think the change needs to be commensurate to the change that we've seen in the kids themselves. The change needs to be seismic. The way that we do ministry has to change.